Greetings again. I'm coming to you from the Draper Public Library, and I want to lecture today on the unit on government regulation of business. A couple things administratively off the top. There is the discussion questions here on a little bit different format than what we had been doing previously. When you get into the unit module, you'll see there's a set of discussion questions, I believe, in a Word program. And instead of having what is really a test format in Blackboard to submit your discussion questions, simply open the Word document and then begin to type in your answer to the particular discussion question you're working on and save it. And then when you have completed the Word document with this set of discussion questions and save the entire Word document, and then you'll see on Blackboard that there is a place to upload the answers to your discussion questions. And then I will grade them as they are submitted. One other thing, there is no set of correct answers with this set of discussion questions. You'll have to rely on your readings and my lecture video, but this one is a little bit different. This is really kind of a civics lesson, and this section of the course actually goes in and goes out depending upon how much time I have in the course to lecture and present the materials. You are one of the lucky ones that get to complete this material. I think this is important materials. It kind of gives you an understanding, especially with what's going on in Washington and the three branches of governments today. Maybe gives you a little bit of background and understanding of exactly what's going on. And when we talk and when you hear government officials, the president or some of the congressional leaders, senators begin to talk about constitutional duties and what is constitutional and what is not constitutional, you begin to have a little better understanding, I hope, of what this all means. In addition, we will discuss the constitutional basis and really where this gets into play, bring it back to the course itself. It really begins to discuss the constitutional basis for all our anti-discrimination and disability legislation that's been acted at the federal level, because very often the question will arise is, what business and what authority does the federal government have in trying to regulate business and tell us that we cannot discriminate and we have to make certain concessions on the issues of disability and things like that. And to be honest, I think there's quite a bit of misinformation, fake news, shall we say, out there about whether or not the federal government really has the power to do this type of stuff. And I think when you look at the Constitution and how the courts have interpreted the Constitution, not Fox News or the president or CNN or anybody else, but how the courts have interpreted the Constitution. And then it really becomes pretty clear that indeed the federal government was given the power by the founding fathers and has the power to do things like outlaw segregation, such as we see in the 1964 Civil Rights Amendment. We'll talk a little bit about what the courts say about the constitutional basis for that. We're going to begin with a little bit of a civics lesson, I guess, and I think to understand government regulation of business in any way, you have to understand a little bit about government. And this section of the course is kind of designed to fill in the blanks for those of you that may not be all that well versed in civics. I think one of the big mistakes education has made, when I went to high school, we had to take a full year of civics courses in our senior year, and we actually had to pass a state civics exam before we could graduate. Don't pass the civics exam, you don't get to graduate. And most of those requirements have gone by the wayside, and I think the body politic is more the worse for it. I think that the lack of understanding and knowledge of how government is structured and how it really works and the legal basis for what it can and cannot do is is lacking, and quite frankly, an understanding of that is essential to being a quote-unquote good citizen. So here's my effort at trying to make us all better citizens. So let's start with the structure of government and just how the government in this country, as it has evolved, how it is structured. I'm going to use the PowerPoint that you can find on this section in this unit module. You should be able to see it. And this first section is labeled sources of law, and one of the things that we as managers need to understand is what levels of government, and there are various levels of government, and what levels of government can and do regulate business activities. And as you can see here, we really have three separate sources of government can and do regulate business. Of course, we have the federal government. We understand that. The federal government is, as we will learn, is established by and governed, and its operation is governed by the United States Constitution. We also have 50 state governments in this country, and each state government generally has a state constitution, and its state government generally is operated, and the authority it has is defined by its state constitution. And in addition to federal level and state level, we have local units of government that can and do regulation business. And these local units of government are creatures of state statutes and or state constitutions. Essentially, for instance, in Illinois, the Illinois Constitution authorizes the Illinois legislature and the governor to pass laws, state laws, authorizing the existence of local units of government. And in Illinois, they've done that. They've passed the county's code, which allows the organization and operation of the local unit of government we know as counties. There is the municipal code, which covers cities. We have townships. We have school districts. And special water districts, sewer districts, and on and on and on. And in Illinois and in most states, then the legislature and or the Constitution allows the creation of these units of local government. And believe me, these units of local government, if you look at those statutes, then will be given the authority and the ability in certain arenas to regulate business. And for instance, we as managers need to understand that, if we have a store we are operating, that we may well, and let's go back to our fast food example, if we're a store manager for a fast food franchise, we may well find that we are responsible for contacting the municipal officials in which we are operating and obtain a business license. If we want to expand, we need to understand or change our operations. We may have to change that business license. We also may have to deal with zoning authorities, whether or not we are able to operate the particular business we are wanting to operate within the particular area we have chosen within a municipality. Also, if we are operating kitchens or serving food or drinks to the public, we may well have to comply with a local health code that requires us to have our kitchens and our facilities inspected and tested and licensed. And quite frankly, as a manager, one of the things that you may be responsible for ensuring is that all of these licenses and inspections have all been complied with, because you can find yourself the doors of your operation shuttered quite quickly if you fail to comply with these local ordinances, we call them, that regulate our operations as a business. So, and I hear this, and I think this is a fairly legitimate criticism, I think, of governments, that business folk, managers, we have to kind of have our head on a swivel, because we're going to find the federal government is going to place requirements, regulation requirements on it that we're going to have to comply with. A state government is going to do the same thing, and so is the local government. And we as managers, quite frankly, are going to be expected to be knowledgeable out and expected to comply, make sure that our operations comply with the various requirements being imposed upon us by these different levels of government. On the next slide here, and this kind of gets us into the nuts and bolts a little bit. Each level of government, whether it be federal, state, or local, is kind of organized and structured along the same line here, and that's that we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And we're going to look at the United States Constitution here momentarily. And when we look at that, we'll actually see that the Constitution has an article, they call it, devoted to the legislative branch, defining what its powers and duties are. That there'll be an article devoted to the legislative branch, Article 1, I believe, in the U.S. Constitution, defining what Congress's powers and duties are, what they can and cannot do. And then we'll also have, I think, Article 3 is the judicial branch in the United States Constitution that defines what the powers and duties of the judiciary are. And we'll find that this structure, executive, legislative, and judicial branches, that the structure repeats at both the state local level in addition to the federal level. For instance, in Illinois, the executive is the governor. We have, again, a bicameral legislature in Illinois. We have a House and a Senate. And then the Illinois Constitution also establishes the Illinois Supreme Court and the lesser and inferior courts then are established by the legislature with. And the same thing repeats again at the local branch, at the local level. For instance, at the municipal level, cities, the executive is what very often we call what? A mayor. The legislative branch will be the city council, and the judicial branch, actually there will be a judicial branch very often, will be called municipal courts, and they will actually have the ability to hear and decide ordinance violations and things of that nature. And so you see the structure repeated over and over again. Now, a brief definition of this, and again, this is just a very brief thumbnail sketch of how these things the Constitution and the statutes have defined the functions of these. But the executive branch, it generally is said their role is to enforce the laws. That's the executive branch's duties. Legislative can be just very briefly stated. That's they make the laws, they enact the laws. And of course, we find that at the federal level and state level both, there is some check on the legislative's ability to make laws because the executive, either the president or the government, has to agree and sign off on them. And if the president or governor doesn't agree, then they can veto, and the law then can go back to the legislature, and they can try to override the veto. So there's checks on that. And lastly, then the judicial branch's role is said to be to interpret the law, and very often you'll hear members of the legislative branch say, well, judicial judges aren't supposed to make law. They're only supposed to interpret. They're not supposed to be active as judges that are supposed to make law. They're only supposed to interpret. You know, guess what? That's all kind of hooey. There are always, we see them all the time, and they're very interesting, frankly, but there are always turf battles going on between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches at all levels of government. It's politics, right? But yeah, it's human nature, I guess, that once you fit into one of these roles, that the inclination is to try to expand your authority and power, and so that results in that inclination results in these turf battles we see between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And we often hear government officials charging that the president or the governor are making their own laws, that they're engaging in unauthorized actions, and that's been a repetitive, I think, theme in the last two administrations. Both President Trump and President Obama have, in their frustrations with the limitations on their ability to address certain problems, have taken steps that may be actually beyond the authority given them under any particular legislative act. And so the legislature and often and the judicial branch will often then tell the executive they have overstepped their bounds. The legislative branch will often complain. Not only has the executive branch engaged in quote-unquote illegal actions that are not authorized by statute or the Constitution, but they'll also accuse the judicial branch of legislating law, that they overstep their bounds when they actually legislate law. The point I want to make here is that looking from a historical point of view, that lawmaking by judges is much older than the fairly recent innovation of legislature, of assemblies of representatives able to enact statutes. That the judicial, the idea of judges and lawmaking judges goes far back to that. It's actually biblical times, the whole ideal, and probably before that. And judges do have a long and rich history in this country, and in English law, of making law. In fact, we have a whole branch of law that we recognize, called the common law, which was established in English law long before the first legislatures were established. And so the whole idea that judges don't make law, have never made law, and that this idea of judicial activism, of judges making law, is that they don't do this and shouldn't do this, is kind of revision history. It comes with the territory. And they are still doing it today. I think one of the most familiar areas, and I just want to address this briefly, one of the most familiar areas, common areas we all understand, that and that the Supreme Court of the United States has been accused of making law, of course, is Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade, of course, says that a woman has a constitutional right to an abortion within certain legal parameters or restrictions. And of course, if you look at the Constitution, nowhere in there does it mention abortion. And if you look at Roe versus Wade, the authors indicated that the right to a woman to an abortion under certain circumstances, to a legal abortion under certain circumstances, is founded in privacy rights. But again, if you look into the Constitution, again, it doesn't really talk about privacy. However, the judges have always interpreted the Constitution in a way that has allowed them the ability to create law when they deemed it to be necessary. And actually, we're going to talk about this a little more. And this, there are 9 judges on the Supreme Court. And if you can get 5 of them to agree that a constitutional right exists, guess what? That constitutional right exists. Now, and let me just point out that it's not just Roe versus Warren Court with Roe versus Wade that's been an activist court. This court under John Roberts has been a quite activist court. It has engaged in some revisionist history and created quite a bit of new law. And so you need to be aware that that process is still going on today. There have been some areas that have been visited by the court recently. Second Amendment is one of them. Prior to the United States Supreme Court opinions that that were, I think, 8 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago, that struck down the handgun bans in Chicago and Washington, D.C. No federal court, let me emphasize this, no, none, zero, no federal court had ever said that the Second Amendment embodied or included an individual's right to possess a firearm. In fact, they had outrightly rejected that interpretation of the Second Amendment. And if you go back and look at what the Founding Fathers were really thinking about when they included the Second Amendment, it becomes quite clear that what they really wanted to do was guarantee a state's right to maintain militia, that is, National Guard troops. There was a very good reason for that. If you recall, that one of the issues that was floating around when the Constitution was written and the Second Amendment adopted was the issue of slavery. And one of the things that the slaveholding states were very afraid of was the fact that somehow or another the federal government would take a federal army down into the South, into the slaveholding states, and by force eliminate slavery and take the property rights of the slaveholding states. And the slaveholding states wanted to make sure they had constitutional guarantees that they were able to do what? Maintain state militias, that is National Guard troops, state army troops, so that in the event that at some point in time the big bad federal government would want to come down with an army to subjugate the slaveholding states, then they would have the ability to resist. And if you look back historically, the Revolutionary War was fought mainly with state militias. And so the states after the Revolutionary War wanted the ability to keep those state militias so that they could maintain some sense of independence from the federal government, and certainly could, as we see in the 1860s, the Civil War was actually fought by what? Mainly by what? Especially in the South, by what? State militias, yes. And that the state militias that the Second Amendment guaranteed the slaveholding states to have actually fought the federal government during the Civil War. And the idea that the Second Amendment included a right for an individual to possess a firearm, and that had been advanced repeatedly, but had been rejected by the courts until recently. My understanding currently, the holding on that, the status is that the court's been rather reluctant, despite what the NRA and some of the conservative commentators would have us believe. The court has restricted that constitutional right so far to only the right to possess a firearm in your home. It has not expanded it, despite what some would have you believe, to include any sort of constitutional right to possess a firearm outside of the home. And I think given some of the problems we are having with gun violence, I think you're going to see the court very reluctant to expand that constitutional right any further at this point, until we begin to get a handle on and understand how we can legitimately regulate some of the, or slow down some of the gun violence we have. Okay, but again, yeah, the point of this is to make sure we understand, do federal and state courts, again, do they legislate at times? Of course they do, and they have in the past. Just as an aside, I know that with the new appointment at the Supreme Court, with Justice Kavanaugh, and this is a point I want to make, is that are we going to see Roe versus Wade change or be repealed? And the answer to that is certainly it's going to be changed, and it could well be repealed. One of the interesting things we will find is that which body, and this is one of your discussion questions, which body under federal government, under the United States Constitution, has the final say on what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. And of course, it's what? The United States Supreme Court. And if there are 5 votes that say something is constitutional, then it's constitutional. And if there are 5 votes to say that it's no longer constitutional, and it's no longer constitutional, I'm not sure you're going to see an outright repeal of Roe, but I think you are going to see more and more power over abortion, and I think it's there de facto anyway, return to the states. One of the interesting things you see, of course, is many states have no or only one abortion clinic in the entire state. I think Missouri is now down to 1 abortion clinic operating outside of St. Louis. I think a state as big as Texas may have as few as 2 or 3. Kansas has none. And so effectively, I think the Supreme Court has abandoned Roe, and I don't think you're going to see 5 votes saying Roe versus Wade is no longer the law of the land. But I think you are going to see decisions which are going to allow greater and greater restrictions on our greater and greater abilities of the states to place restrictions on abortion. The next slide addresses this thing called administrative agencies. This is an important, they are created at all levels of government. And this is a very important tool that governments utilize to effect their regulation of business. These government agencies are created by what we call enabling legislation, that are acts passed by the legislature and signed by the executive branch. What it essentially does very often is creates a statute which will govern some sort of activity, very often some sort of business activity, and not solely though, but some sort of business activity, and then will create this administrative agency, which essentially becomes part of the executive's staff with bureaucrats, right, that are then given the ability to enforce and administer the legislation. We've already talked about one administrative agency, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Of course, that is created by that agency is created by the federal anti-discrimination and disability laws, and is given the authority to enforce and execute the mandate of the anti-discrimination and disability laws at the federal level. You also see all sorts of other administrative agencies, right? The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, of course, is created by the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and of course is charged with administering and enforcing those two acts. And the federal government is full of administrative agencies, not just the EPA, but we also have the IRS, and the Health and Human Services, of course, which contains the biggest administrative agency of all, which I believe is the Social Security Administration. And of course, it's charged with interpreting and enforcing the Social Security Act and determining what benefits we're entitled to. And if we disagree with that, it actually does have a judicial arm that allows us to go and have a hearing. And so, yeah, the federal government has a whole lot of these. State government also loves these things. In Illinois, we have our own EPA. We have the Human Rights Commission, of course, which is Illinois' counterpart to the EEOC. We have the Department of Revenue, and on and on and on. And of course, again, and they are all of these administrative agencies are charged with enforcing the various acts under which they are authorized. State and local governments also create administrative agencies, housing authorities, health departments, which are charged often with inspecting and ensuring that businesses that serve food and beverage they are complying with the health code and properly. And one of the other interesting, I think, points here of administrative agencies, they will also very often be structured along the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. For instance, the Illinois Worker Compensation Commission will have a head of the agency, and then it will have a commission that will promulgate rules and regulations about how Illinois worker compensation is to be administered. And then they will also have hearing officers which will hear cases and determine whether or not you're entitled to worker compensation benefits, and if so, how much. And of course, there are appeal processes associated with that. And so if you look at the Illinois Worker Compensation Commission, you can see that three-tier structure repeated, where there's an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Okay, as I've already indicated, I think the United States Constitution is the document which establishes and governs the operation of the federal government. At the various state governments also have constitutions that establish how and what powers state government have. Now, as I indicated to you, the importance of the Constitution is that no branch of government in the United States Constitution is quite clear on this. We'll expand on this in a moment when we talk about the Supremacy Clause. But we need to make sure that we understand that no branch of government at the federal, state, or local level can act in contravention of the United States Constitution. In other words, it's the highest authority, legal authority of the land. And so that means that the federal government any action of the federal government that violates the United States Constitution is illegal. But also, as we will see, any action of a state government or a unit of local government that violates the United States Constitution is also illegal. So we need to make sure we understand that it does, the United States Constitution does place limits on the power of all three of those levels of government: federal, state, and local. And okay, now, which branch of government has the final say on what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. That is what government can do and what power it does have and what power it does not have. And that's the United States Supreme Court. And its determination of what is constitutional and what is not constitutional, that is what's legal under the Constitution and what's illegal under the Constitution, it has the final say. And once it has spoken, the debate is supposed to be over. I know it's often not, but from a legal point of view, they have the final say. And I think I have already indicated, it's a 9-judge body, and any 5 justices that join together in a majority opinion will tell us what is constitutional, what is unconstitutional. And can they change that? Does it evolve? Does the Constitution evolve? Yes, of course it does. The living, breathing document, and it is important to understand that. And I'll talk just briefly about this whole idea that some justices seem to have that that the Constitution only means what the founders believed it to mean, and we need to be very careful about that because that is clearly, I think, a way to interpret the Constitution in such a way that really, I think, inhibits social progress and equal rights for all. And we'll talk about that. Okay. I think I've already given you a couple examples of when the United States Constitution has examined a government action and determined what's constitutional and what's not. Roe versus Wade, of course, is one. In those cases, Roe versus Wade, the court in the early 70s was examining whether state law that prohibited a woman from getting an abortion, making it illegal, whether those state laws violated the United States Constitution. And the Supreme Court looked at the issue in Roe versus Wade and determined that we must balance the rights of the mother versus the rights of the unborn child. And essentially, we lawyers are trying to be what we call rationalists. We try to address issues like this rationally. And what they did, they said, well, according to science at the time, and this is the early 1970s, a child cannot generally survive outside its mother's womb until it's reach somewhere in the neighborhood of 21, 22, 23, 3 weeks after conception. And then they said, well, and after that, science tells us that a child has a reasonable chance of being viable, that is, surviving outside the mother's womb and leading a relatively normal life. And they said that that was a rational point from which they could balance the interests of the mother versus the interests of the unborn child. And essentially what they said is up to that point where the child becomes viable, that is can survive outside the mother's womb at 21 or 22 or 23 weeks. And then up to that point, the mother's privacy's interests in her own body and determining whether or not she indeed wants to carry the pregnancy to term, that privacy interest, the mother's interest, outweighs that of the unborn child. And then after the point of 21, 22, 23 weeks, then the interest of the unborn child outweighs that of the mother. Morally, whether that's right or wrong, I don't want to get into that. But at that point, the Supreme Court said that we're going to give a woman a constitutional right to choose whether or not to carry the pregnancy to term within those limitations. Roe versus Wade in a nutshell. And of course, again, the idea being is that was an entirely new concept, but it actually was not. It was an idea that had been evolving for many, many years out of the idea that our rights to reproduction and our sexual orientation rights are something that needed constitutional protections. We began to see an evolution of that with the sodomy laws, for instance. Many folks, gay folk, were put in jail for a long, extended period of time for engaging in homosexual acts. And the idea that those could be constitutional was rejected by the court in the 50s. Also included rejection of the idea of banning biracial marriages. You got to remember, it's not been that long ago that it was illegal for people of color to marry people of non-color in many states. And so Roe versus Wade was an evolution along that step. And ultimately, I think we've seen that grow. And again, I think this is an example of the court saying what's constitutional, not constitutional, is the whole idea of gay marriage. That the equal protection of the law demanded that states recognize the rights of individuals to engage in the act of marriage, regardless of their sexual orientation. In other words, it didn't matter. It didn't have to be. You don't have to be a man. Only men and women could get married. But indeed, that state laws banning or saying marriage can only be between a man and a woman or unconstitutional. Again, that's the Supreme Court declaring that these privacy rights deserve constitutional protections. And so they have told us recently then that state laws banning gay marriage then are unconstitutional and cannot be enforced, and that all of us have a constitutional right then to marry the partners of our choice. Okay, and I, you know, and the court's going to go on and continue. I think you can also, understand this whole area of gay marriage and some of the expansion of gay rights. Then some may accuse the court of judicial activism, that they're legislating law. But again, I think this is simply the court using its ability to interpret the Constitution, again, to make it a living, breathing document that has meaning to us today, that does protect rights that become important to us, and does not allow governments to use laws to oppress otherwise law-abiding citizens from engaging in or prevent us discrimination against otherwise law-abiding citizens, I guess. Can the United States Constitution be amended? We know the United States Supreme Court is constantly giving us new interpretations of what it means, what the Constitution means, but can we actually amend the Constitution? Can it be amended? Yes. The Constitution itself provides for a process by which it can be amended. I think the one that has been most commonly used in the past is where the United States Congress, that is the House and the Senate, each independently by a 2/3 vote, need to adopt the particular language which they wish to use to amend the Constitution. And then after each House and the Senate has passed the particular language by a 2/3 vote, then each House, after that has occurred, then the legislatures of each of the states then must ratify the particular language of the constitutional amendment. And 3/4 of the state legislatures, of the 50 state legislatures, must do so within a certain period of time. And I believe it's 60 months currently, I think is what the statute says. It's the United States Constitution has been amended. If you look at the Constitution itself, I think we've had 27 amendments, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look and see. I had a copy of it here. Let's pull it up and see if we can find it. You should be now be looking at a copy of the Constitution. Let's see. Hopefully this, yeah, all right. Let's see, has amendments. Yeah, looks like we have 25 here. The 25th Amendment, of course, has been brought up recently with regard to President Trump and his fitness to serve in office. There's been some discussion about doing that. There have been constitutional amendments that have been passed and then repealed. Of course, the Volstead Amendment, I believe it was called, if you look at it, the 18th Amendment, which barred the manufacture and sale of alcoholic intoxicating beverages within the United States. That, of course, was passed in 1919. Interesting, ladies, part of the abolition movement with regard, the ban on alcoholic beverages was that the passage of that was also part and parcel of the suffrage vote, which was that is gave women the right to vote. Let me see, I'm trying to, 14, 16, yeah, the 19th Amendment. If you look at it, the 18th and the 19th Amendment were passed together. Carrie Nation and the suffragettes banded together with the folks that wanted to see liquor abolished. And in 1919, not only did ladies get the vote here in the United States for the first time, but also the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages was abolished. Of course, later in 1933, Congress in the states then later on repealed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and again allowed the production and sale of intoxicating liquors. Some constitutional amendments have passed the House and the Senate, but failed to get the appropriate ratifications in the state legislature in a timely manner. The Equal Rights Amendment was that. Happened like that. My generation, I know I was drafted in 1970. My generation, one of the I guess rallying calls of my generation was the fact that at 19 I was drafted, but I was not allowed to vote until 21, and in response to that seeming, and I think it was injustice, that we could be sent off to fight for our country, but we're not allowed to vote. The voting age was lowered in the country to 21. And so, yeah, the Constitution can be changed. It has been changed in the past. We have seen amendments passed, and we have seen amendments kind of passed but end up failing, and we also have seen amendments repealed. Okay, now there's a couple specific areas of the Constitution we need to discuss, and that's going to kind of get us into what I really want us to know for this section, this unit. And the first particular section of the Constitution, I apologize, I'm doing the wrong thing here. How about that one? You got that one? Yeah. The first particular area of the Constitution I want to talk about here is this idea of the Supremacy Clause. And it's in Article 6 of the United States Constitution. Let me see if I can pull up that portion of the Constitution just to read it, just to make sure. Article 6, that's 4, that's 6 right there. Yeah. And let's see if I can highlight this. If it's going to let me do it. Yeah. This, ooh, okay. I've highlighted what we call the Supremacy Clause. And it says, this Constitution, meaning that this document, and of course what the Supreme Court says it means, and the laws of the United States, and that's a big inclusion. And of course, the laws of the United States are going to include those passed by the Congress and signed by the President, but also we will find out, the courts have told us a lot, that this phrase, laws of the United States, also means that rules and regulation of administrative agencies are included when this concept of laws of the United States. So we got this Constitution and the laws of the United States, including rules and regulations of administrative agencies, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, which means that the laws have to be constitutional, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Shall be the supreme law of the land. And further, judges in individual states shall be bound by thereby, and anything in the constitutional laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding. Now here's what this is really saying, folks. It's saying judges, state judges, guess what? You shall follow the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and you shall, where they conflict, disregard those laws of your state. And essentially what this does, this means that the Constitution and the laws of the United States can and do override state law and state constitutions, local law, and local ordinances. Make sure you understand that. And this is, I know that a lot of state rights folks, quote unquote conservatives, that this is distasteful to them, I guess, shall we put it. But and very often they will claim, founding fathers didn't intend to create a strong centralized federal government. Horse hockey, yes, they did. And this is Exhibit 1. And the courts have said and consistently interpreted that the Constitution and the laws of the United States and the rules and regulations of federal agencies are the supreme law of the land. And essentially that tells us that when the really means is that when the United States Supreme Court says Roe versus Wade is the supreme law of the land, and that states must allow abortions within certain parameters, then they have to follow that, even if what? State constitution and state law says no abortions allowed. Same thing with, in a more modern context, or more recent context, I guess I should say, that when, that the United States Supreme Court has said that states that define marriage as a union between a man and a woman, that those laws are invalid and unenforceable. And under the Supremacy Clause, since we have said the Constitution provides an individual to celebrate the buying, the marriage, and it doesn't have to be between a man and woman, then that's the law of the land. And that's by virtue then of this thing called the Supremacy Clause. And that's, and again, that should indicate to us then that that the founding fathers did fully intend that that when the Congress acts, that is, passes a law, and the Supreme Court finds that that's a appropriate action, that is, that it's constitutional, then it's the law of the land. And it also provides then also that the interpretations of the Supreme Court of what the Constitution means is also the law of the land. And it can and it will and does override state constitutions, state law, and local law. And of course, that should tell us then that when Congress passed the 1947 or 1964 Civil Rights Act, excuse me, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, that was challenged by opponents as being unconstitutional. When the court said that it was indeed constitutional, it was the law of the land, and it did overturn and make illegal the Jim Crow laws in the South, that is, the segregation laws in the South. Now, as I had mentioned to you, this idea of laws of the United States does include administrative rules and regulations. And we need to make sure that we understand that these laws of the United States and the Supremacy Clause includes these. Because essentially what that means is that an administrative agency such as the EPA, those rules and regulations that have been passed by the EPA, those can and do overrule state law, state constitution. For instance, the EPA, when it begins to issue regulations appropriately that govern emissions from coal-fired power plants, those have the force and effect of law once they truly become effective. That is, once the court challenges to them have been concluded, and they become final. And the question becomes, okay, we have state-owned utilities. Okay, These are owned and operated by state government. Utah has a whole series of coal-fired power plants here sitting by coal mines, that they use to generate electricity that they sell to the West Coast. And the question becomes, okay, can the EPA make the state of Utah then observe these rules and regulations concerning emissions from coal-fired power plants? The answer to that's yes. Under the Supremacy Clause, then these EPA rules and regulations are considered to be the laws of the United States, part of those, and therefore under the Supremacy Clause, if they are valid, then guess what? States like Utah have to follow and observe them. And so can Utah be forced to modify their state-owned power plants to comply with these federal rules and regulations? And the answer is under the Supremacy Clause to that, of course, is yes. So that's the importance of understanding, making sure we understand the reach of the federal government through these administrative agencies it can be quite far, and they can and they do require state agencies to follow these rules. Especially when you get into the areas of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, can the EPA force state governments to follow those acts? And the answers, and with regard to their water sources and the way they operate their Department of Natural Resources and things like that, and the answer is clearly yes. And why? The Supremacy Clause, which says that laws of the United States and the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Okay, I think the next thing I want to talk about, we've talked about the Supremacy Clause. The next thing I want to talk about is the Commerce Clause. This is found in the Enumerated Powers of Congress section. And this is a very interesting idea here and it's pretty important that we try to understand this. Let me see, let me find my Constitution here, and we'll go to the Enumerated Powers of Congress. Here, that's of course, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in Article 1. Membership, enjoyment, revenue, powers of Congress, right here. Let me just make sure here. Am I recording? I hope I am. I am. All right. Says I am. Okay. Let's start this then. Article 1, Section 8, as you can see, is labeled Powers of Congress. Let's digress here for a minute and backtrack for just a second. And kind of talk a little bit about how this Commerce Clause evolved. The Constitution was actually adopted in 1787. The first 10 amendments followed 2 or 3 years later, I think in 1791 or 4 years later, maybe 1791, something like that. Now, 1787, we adopted the Constitution. It was 1776, a number of years earlier, that we had the Declaration of Independence, July 1776, written by Thomas Jefferson. And we told King George to go stick it. You know, that we were going to, the 13 colonies were going to go out on their own. And the question becomes, was there a document then between 1776 in 1787, which governed, and the adoption of the Constitution, which governed the relationship between the 13 colonies, the original 13 states. And the answer to that, of course, is yes, and it's called the Articles of Confederation. And essentially what this did, it established a loose confederation among the states, and set up the Continental Congress. But it was truly a states' rights document. That is, that all the power within the country laid with the states, that the Continental Congress and what we would view as the federal government at that point in time had very little, if any, power. It could not tax. It could spend, but only by borrowing money. And it was, as I said, it was essentially a state rights document. It caused real problems and difficulties for George Washington and what I will call the Founding Fathers, from the point of view that it made it very difficult to fight the Revolutionary War. Now, initially, sorry, I apologize for the interruption. They're telling me I'm going to get kicked out in 30 minutes, but we'll be done by then. Now, George Washington and his Continental Congressional Army, what there was of it initially was established by monies donated by the states to the federal government. Initially, George Washington's army was funded by the states, since the Congress, the Continental Congress, didn't have the ability to tax. The federal government was entirely dependent upon donations and its ability to borrow to raise funds to fight the Revolutionary War. And as I suggested to you earlier, much of the Revolutionary War was fought by state militias. Now, we almost lost the Revolutionary War because of these lack of funds. And one of the most interesting, I think, stories of the Revolutionary War is Benjamin Franklin's adventures in France. And he was sent over there very early on by the Continental Congress in an effort to enlist French support, in particular, ships and arms and money to fight the revolution, that is, to defeat the British. And of course, if you look at this in a historical perspective, at this point in time, France and Britain had been at war with each other for years and would continue to be at war with each other for a number of years in the future. There was a little bit of a pause at this point. France wasn't quite sure it wanted to jump back into a conflict with Great Britain with both feet at this point in time. So they were doing a little bit of a go slow thing with regard to supporting the American Revolution. And Benjamin Franklin was in France to attempt to influence the French court to speed up its aid of the colonies. It's an interesting story. It's a great story, actually, how he managed over the period of time he was in Paris to accomplish the task, because eventually the French did come to our aid. Initially, Franklin could not get in to see any of the French ministers. The king wouldn't see him. None of the French court would see him. He was kind of person non grande, that he was not welcome. But he was a pretty smart guy, and what he did was he used the salon. The salon, of course, was the French version of let's party till daylight. In other words, in the French court engaged in the salon, and the French ministers, that was their social gatherings, I guess. And essentially salons would start at 10 o'clock at night and finish up at dawn. And Benjamin Franklin would attend these salons dressed in buckskins and coonskin caps, while the rest of the French courtiers, of course, were there in powdered wigs and very fancy dress. And Franklin actually became quite well known by his dress, and had hundreds and hundreds of coonskin caps shipped over to give to the French courtiers as calling cards, so that they would remember him. And eventually he did begin to kind of worm his way into French society, and therefore into the French courtiers and the ministers, and began to have quite a bit of influence eventually with King Louis and the French court, and eventually got the aid that we needed to defeat the British. And the point of this being, of course, we almost lost the Revolutionary War for a lack of funds. That's the lesson of George Washington and the Winter of Valley Forge, that the Continental Army became almost nothing during that period of time. And it was only with the intervention of the French, with their arms and money and ships, and that actually allowed us to defeat the British and win independence. And so one of the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that occurred was that they had in the new Constitution the power to tax and spend. And of course, when you look at the enumerated powers of Congress here, Section 8, what's the very first thing? Right? That's right. Yeah, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and exercises, pay the debts of the United States, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. And also look at number 2 here, was to borrow money on the credit. So it's clear that the Founding Fathers wanted to ensure that the federal government had the full ability and authority to tax and spend and borrow. And of course, that was the first 2 things they listed here on the enumerated powers of Congress. Now, number 3 here is, there's this legal idea that when we're making lists of things, and that's what this is, this Section 8 is a list of the powers of Congress, we list the ones first that we think are most important, right? And the ones are not, maybe we don't think are quite as important, we kind of tag on to the end. But when, the first ones here, they're the most important ones. And so we got taxing, spending, and borrowing, 1, 2, and 3. And then right behind it here is the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And let me try and relate the history to you a little bit of why the Founding Fathers included this idea that Congress had the ability to regulate commerce between the states and with the Indian tribes. And it has to do with this and what happened immediately after 1776 with regard to free trade among the states. Role playing very quickly. I'm a Pennsylvania coal mine owner. Things are going good for me in 1776. There are lots of forges going in the area, making iron and steel for the Revolutionary War. They're ordering a whole bunch of my coal, and I'm just a happy camper. I'm making money hand over foot selling coal to the arm manufacturers. Now, a couple of my customers, longtime customers, don't place new orders. Haven't heard from them for a few weeks. And I wonder what's going on. So I get on my get my carriage out and trot on down to my customer, talk to the forge owner, and he tells me, well, this fella from Virginia came over and he told me that he would sell me his coal from Virginia for $0.05 a ton less than you were charging me. And I'm sorry, but you know, money is money, profit is profit, and I ordered from him, and I've been using his coal. And you're going, oh, okay, here's the deal. Order from me, and I'll beat his price by $0.05 a ton. And the forge owner says, yeah, okay, sign me up. Send me an order. Okay, and so the Pennsylvania coal miner fills that order, but he doesn't hear from the forge owner again for a while. He goes back down there and he says, well, the fella came back and he again undercut you and offered to sell me your coal for 5 cents a ton less than you just sold me the last bunch. So I ordered from him. And you're going, oh. And so again, you say, okay, well, I'll beat his price. I'll go 5 cents a ton less. And the guy says, great. Now, of course, what are the two coal mines doing? They're competing on the basis of what? Price, right? And of course, that's tough competition, isn't it? When we look at how do we compete, there's only a few bases we compete. One is price, other is quality of goods or services. But when we have to compete in those areas, what happens to our margins? What happens to our profits? They go down the tubes, don't they? Yeah. That and despite what we hear from companies, we don't like competition. Competition sucks, right? Yeah, it cuts into our profits and our margins. And in fact, one of the major business plans we see being pursued by companies today is eliminate the competition. If we eliminate the competitions, our margins go up. And so we see companies when they run headlong into competitors, what do? Instead of competing with them, they do what? Buy them out. That's the whole idea of market share. Competition sucks. Bigger our market share, the more of a monopolistic position we can obtain, and the better our margins are, the better our profits are. So, yeah, we hate competition. And this is an interesting point that still goes on today and is still used today, is that very often government can be business's best friend. Hello, what a novel idea. So what's our Pennsylvania coal producer do? What's he do? It's real easy. He puts some money in his pocket. He goes off to the state capitol in Scranton. He gets a hold of the governor and the legislature, and he spreads some of that money around. And of course, what did he want the state to do? How about we impose some import tariffs? Those are big in the news today, right? President Trump likes tariffs too. And so essentially then what do? We have the state of Pennsylvania impose an import tariff against all imported coal. We impose a 25 cent a ton tariff on all imported coal, and guess what? All of a sudden our profits go way back up, because now to be able to compete with us, that Virginia coal producer now has to pay that 25-cent a ton tariff on top of his production costs. That leaves us plenty of room to undercut him with regard to price. Yeah, and still have what? A generous margin. And essentially, it's an artificial barrier, right? To the importation of the coal. It's an artificial tax on the consumers of the coal. They eventually do have to pay that price. Now, if you're the Virginia coal producer, when you see what Pennsylvania's done to you, what are you going to do? You're going to retaliate by doing what? Going to Richmond and getting Richmond to impose what? A tariff on all coal imported into Virginia. And so we have these trade barriers popping up. And essentially what we found right after 1776, and since each state was kind of an individual little fiefdom and had states' rights powers, we saw that all states began to enact tariffs, that are trade barriers on all sorts of goods and commodities. And of course, what happened to the economy of the United States? Well, essentially what happened to trade between the states? It essentially ceased to do what? Ceased to exist, right? That the states were favoring with these tariffs in-state producers over out-of-state producers. And of course, that was impediment to free trade across the borders. That immediately sent the economy of the 13 states into a tailspin. It stopped, virtually stopped, since all these tariffs were imposed on foodstuffs, all sorts of energy, timber, coal, iron, all sorts of commodities where trade was stopped between the states, and it sent the states, the economy of the states, into a tailspin, into a depression. Okay. Now, what that meant was that the founding fathers understood that they could not tolerate states having the ability to regulate commerce between the states. And thus we have the Interstate Commerce Clause. This clause simply says that states cannot impede commerce by imposing tariffs or other artificial borders or artificial impediments to interstate commerce. Okay, now essentially what this means in practice today is the states cannot impose any burden that restricts interstate commerce. Can any branch of government regulate commerce? Yes. Congress has the exclusive right to regulate interstate commerce. And that's under the Commerce Clause, and the states do not have that right. And any attempt by the states to impede or otherwise regulate commerce between the states is illegal. Now, in today's context, we don't particularly have tariffs anymore. But we do have scenarios where states attempt to put up artificial barriers in an attempt to favor out-of-state producers. In the Commerce Clause hypothetical I've given you, the trucking companies here, the lobbying representatives for the trucking companies in Georgia and Florida decided that they wanted to capture the entire trucking market between Florida and Georgia. They share a long border. There's just a couple of interstates that go through that, and they decided that they would enact a scheme that would freeze out truckers from other states. In other words, if you were not part of a trucking firm in Florida or Georgia, you would not be able to carry freight across the Georgia Florida border. And it kind of went like this. They used mud flaps. Georgia said only one type of mud flap could be utilized in their state. Florida said only one type of mud flap could be used in their state, and of course they were entirely different mud flaps. And of course, to cross the border then required the use of two different mud flaps, which of course was logistically impossible. Essentially, when the courts looked at this, what they found the trucking firms were doing was they had transfer stations that only the favored trucking firms could use. In other words, the Georgia trucking firm would pull up to the transfer station at the state line and transfer its load to the Georgia trucking company at the transfer station, and then the Florida company would take it on down to its destination. When the loads were going north, the Florida trucking firm would carry the load as far as the border, then the Georgia trucking firm with the appropriate types of mud flaps would take it beyond that. And of course, truckers from out of state that weren't part of this consortium then could not cross the Georgia-Florida border. The court said that that was an impermissible burden upon interstate commerce, and that regulatory scheme was illegal. We see that type of stuff still going on today, where local producers of goods and services will go to individual states and lobby to get certain advantages over out-of-state producers. We have seen that in the liquor and wine industry recently, I think, where some states, in an effort to protect their local producers from out-of-state shipments of wine, have said that, yeah, well, we have the right under our police powers to license and regulate alcohol sales. Well, we're going to say that if you want to sell any alcohol in this state by any method, that you have to actually have an in-state presence. In other words, you actually have to get a license and open a physical store within the state of brick and mortar stores. And of course, what that was designed to do, I think Michigan was designed to do, was prevent Washington and California from shipping their wines, those vineyards from shipping their wines in by case lots to individual consumers in the state. And the idea being is that since they weren't licensed and they didn't have a physical presence within the state, a bricks and mortar store, they couldn't ship their wine into the state. That, of course, was challenged by Washington, by those vintners. And the court said, well, yeah, you can make them get the license and pay the fees, but you can't make them have the physical presence. That was simply a way to impede online interstate sales of wine, and that there was no rational reason other than you were attempting to protect the local producers from competition from the out-of-state vintners, and that particular part of the regulatory scheme was illegal. And with that, I think I'm going to call this lecture concluded. I will be online to discuss this unit further on Tuesday evening. And if you have any questions or other ideas, I can address them at that time.